Hi, my name is Jocelyn Neal, and this video is about part writing for the AP Music Theory exam. Specifically, today we are going to look at the part writing techniques used for deceptive motion or deceptive cadences. And I recommend before you watch this video that you click on the link below it and print out the worksheet so that you can follow along and do the work yourself right along with me. What we're going to be talking about today are the part writing rules for deceptive motion, which can occur anywhere in a phrase or at the end of a phrase where we would identify it as a deceptive cadence. The part writing rules are very strict and also very simple. The simple rule is that all of our upper voices, which is the tenor, the alto, and the soprano, must move to scale degrees 1 or 3 when we move from our dominant chord to our triad built on scale degree 6. The way to think about this is that a deceptive cadence allows the bass, and only the bass, to surprise us by moving to a note that is not part of the expected tonic triad. That's the deception, and the bass gets to do it. So let's begin. We have a worksheet in front of us, and we're going to work through this together. We're going to look at 2 chord progressions, moving from a dominant triad or dominant 7th chords into that arrival on the triad built on scale degree 6. We're going to start in the key of G major, and I've labeled my Roman numerals here. We have a dominant triad moving to the minor chord built on scale degree 6. As I part write that dominant triad, D, F sharp, A, I remember my rule, which is all 3 upper voices, tenor, alto, and soprano, must move to either scale degree 1 or scale degree 3. Those notes are G and B. So I'm going to take my soprano down to G, and I'm going to take my tenor down to B, and I'm going to allow my alto to step up and double the note with the soprano. Next one, we're in the key of F major. I have a dominant 7th chord moving to the triad built on scale degree 6. That's my deceptive motion. I'm going to spell my dominant 7th chord, putting the chordal 7th, B flat in the soprano, and filling in the rest of my chord, C, E, G, B flat. Remembering my rule, all my upper voices move to scale degrees 1 and 3. My soprano is the chordal 7th, and chordal 7ths must step down. So I'll take my soprano down to an A. My leading tone in the alto is going to move up from E to F, and my tenor will step down from G to F. Now you'll notice as we do each of these that the chord we land on, which is our 6th chord, has a doubled third. That is typical, expected, and correct. Now we're in the key of E flat major, and I'm spelling my dominant triad, B flat, D, F. And now I'm going to move that to a 6th chord, C, E flat, and G. I'm going to allow my soprano, in this case, to move down from B flat to G. My tenor is stepping up from D to E flat, and my alto is moving from F down to E flat. Now I always try to find the perfect 5th in my dominant triad and make sure I did not move in parallel 5ths. So here I've bracketed that 5th. Let's work on the next one. We are in D major, and I'm spelling my dominant 7th chord, A, C sharp, E, and G. I chose to put the leading tone, C sharp, in the soprano, and my chordal 7th, G, is in the alto. Chordal 7ths must go down. Leading tones in outer voices must go up. So my soprano C sharp must go up to D. My alto G, which is the chordal 7th, must go down to F sharp. And I'm going to take my tenor down to D as well. All right, let's move into some examples in minor keys. We'll begin here in the key of E minor. I'm taking a look at that figured bass, which tells me the intervals above the bass. When I see a 6, I know that's shorthand for 6-3, and I'm going to have the notes in that chord that are a 6th and 3rd above the bass. The same thing applies for my 2nd chord. That's going to be F sharp AC. And as I look at my 3rd chord, I see that sharp all by itself in the figured bass, and I know that applies to a 3rd above the bass. So a 3rd above the bass is going to be D sharp. That 5th above the bass is F sharp. And the 7th of this chord will be an A, which I circle to keep track of my chordal 7ths. The last chord is simply a triad, C, E, G. As I begin my part writing, I'm going to place scale degree 5, the note B in the soprano, and we'll just try that particular voicing. We'll place an E in the alto, and I'll double that B in the tenor. As we move into the second chord, I'm going to move the soprano in contrary motion and have it step down to an A. I'll move the tenor up to C, and I will move the alto up to F sharp. Now, as we move into that third chord, I know that there is both a leading tone and a chordal seventh in that chord. It's very tempting to move the tenor up towards that D sharp, but notice that if we do that, we have an augmented second, which is a dissonant interval and unacceptable in our part writing. So make sure you avoid those augmented seconds between lowered scale degree 6 and raised scale degree 7. Instead, I'll have the alto move down to the D sharp. I'm going to keep my common tone A in the soprano, which becomes the chordal seventh. And I'll have my tenor step down to B. You'll notice there is no F sharp in this chord. It is always acceptable to omit the fifth of a chord in root position. Now, as I resolve that dominant seventh chord, the chordal seventh in the soprano, the note A must step down to G. I will allow the leading tone to come up to E, and my tenor will skip down to G. As I part write my chord progression, I have 1-6, 2 diminished 6, 5-7, and that deceptive motion into a major 6 chord. This part writing example gives us a lot to look at, so let's go ahead and try a different initial voicing. We have the same bass line and the same figures, so the pitch content of each chord will be exactly the same. Let's voice that first chord differently. Let's put scale degree 3, the note G, in the soprano. We will fill in the rest of the voicing with an E in the alto and a B in the tenor. I will continue that idea of contrary motion and move my soprano down to an F sharp. The alto skips down to C and the tenor steps down to A. Now, let's see what happens if our soprano moves down to catch that leading tone D sharp and we try to keep the tenor on the common tone A. That tenor has now become the chordal seventh, and let's resolve this voicing. My leading tone D sharp in the soprano must go up. My chordal seventh in the tenor must go down. What to do with the alto? Well, it can't go up to C. That would be parallel octaves and an incorrect doubling. So let's try moving that down to G. The doubling is fine. The chord pitch content is fine, but I have a voice overlap error. The alto voice has moved to a note that is lower than the previous chord's tenor note. So this is not correct voice leading. We want to avoid voice overlaps. Let's back up and try a different solution. I'm still going to move my soprano down to D sharp. But now I'm going to have my alto skip down to the chordal seventh, the pitch A, and I'll move my tenor all the way down to F sharp. As I resolve this chord, my leading tone in the soprano must go up to E, my chordal seventh must move down to G, and the tenor will step down to E. This is a correct doubling and correct voice leading for that chord. Now, this is such an interesting example. Let's work it one more time. We've already tried scale degree 5 in the soprano and now scale degree 3 in the soprano. So let's try our third option. We're going to place scale degree 1 in the soprano this time. The soprano will be on E, the alto will be on E, and the tenor will be on B. This is an open spacing for this chord. As I move into my second chord, I want to keep in mind that the voices need to stay within an octave of each other between the soprano alto and the alto tenor. So I'm going to move my soprano down to C, my alto up to F sharp, and my tenor down to A. Remember that that C natural in the soprano cannot move up to D sharp. That would be an augmented second and a voice leading error. Instead, I'll simply move my soprano down to the pitch B. And since I have doubled a note in the 7th chord, I know I'm going to have to omit the 5th. My alto can move down to the leading tone D sharp. My tenor can maintain its common tone A for the chordal 7th. As I resolve this chord, the chordal 7th must move down by step to G. The soprano B has to move down to a G, and my alto can step up. That gives me a correct doubling and good voice leading throughout this progression. So now we've looked at 3 different options for initial chord voicings and their potential part writing solutions. Let's continue working now. Our next example is in the key of D minor. I'm going to collect the pitch content of each chord and write it above the staff. I notice that the pitch content of the first 2 chords is the same. My next chord has a sharp by itself that will apply to the 3rd above the bass. And my final chord is a triad, B flat, D, F. I'll voice this initial chord with a D in the soprano, an F in the alto, and an A in the tenor. I will keep those 3 pitches constant moving into the next chord. Remember, this is perfectly acceptable voice leading. Moving into the next chord, I'll move the soprano down to C sharp, keep the tenor on an A, and move the alto down to E. The outer voice leading tone, C sharp, must move up in the soprano. I can allow the tenor to skip down to an F, and I can allow the alto to step down to a D. I notice there's a 5th, a perfect 5th, between the bass and the alto. And that means I have to be very careful not to move the alto to a pitch that would cause parallel 5ths. Especially in part writing Deceptive Motion, I always want to locate the perfect 5th and make sure that it's not moving in parallel motion. The next example is in E minor. The initial chord has the figured bass of 6/5. I know that also implies a 3rd above the bass. So the pitch content of that chord is G, B natural, D, F. Circle the F, which is the chordal 7th. Second chord is a triad, C, E flat, G. The 3rd chord is another 7th chord, G, B natural, D, F. And the final chord is a triad, A flat, C, E flat. I'll voice this initial chord with the note D in the soprano, place the chordal 7th F in the alto, and the root of the chord G in the tenor. As I move into the next chord, my chordal 7th in the alto must resolve down. I'll keep the common tone G in the tenor and move my melody to the note C. Continuing onward, I will allow the soprano to move down to the leading tone B natural, step the alto back up to the chordal 7th F, and keep that common tone in the tenor. Notice that nice, steady tenor line. I'll resolve the leading tone in my soprano up to C, my chordal 7th F down to E flat, and my tenor can move down to E flat as well. My chord progression is 5-6-5, 1, 5-7, 6. And the final example on this page is in the key of B minor. I check my figured bass and identify the pitch content of each chord, B, D, F sharp. The next chord, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, E. I know that that sharp in the figured bass applies to a 3rd above the bass. My next chord is a G major triad, G, B, D. And my final chord has the figured bass of 6/5, which tells me the pitch content of that chord is C sharp, E, G, B. I will voice my initial chord with a B, tonic in the soprano. I'll place an F sharp in the alto and a D in the tenor. As I move into my next chord, I will allow my soprano to step up to C sharp. I'll move my tenor down to the leading tone, and I'll fill in my alto with the pitch E. Now that leap in the tenor, take a look at that. The leap in the tenor moves from a D to an A sharp. It's an unusual leap, but it is both stylistically correct and the best solution for filling in my voices given the soprano that I chose. Once the tenor is on A sharp, it's going to move up to B, resolving that leading tone. The soprano steps down to B. And as I move into my final chord, remember this is not the end of this piece, it's just the end of this part writing exercise. The soprano will remain on B, becoming the chordal seventh. The alto steps down to C sharp, and the tenor skips down to G. The chord progression here is 1, 6, 5, 7, 6, 2, half diminished, 6, 5. Now this particular chord progression deserves another look. We're going to start with the same pitch content because we have the same bass line and figures, and I'm going to voice the initial chord the same way. I'll put a B in the soprano, an F sharp in the alto, and a D in the tenor. This time, as I move into my second chord, I'm going to place that leading tone A sharp in the soprano, and I'll have my alto move into the chordal seventh, which is the pitch E, and my tenor step down to C sharp. As I resolve that dominant seventh chord, the leading tone in the soprano, the A sharp, must go up to B. The alto chordal seventh E must go down to D, and my tenor C sharp can move down to B. That is the correct doubling for that chord. As I move into my final chord, I'll move the soprano back up to C sharp. I will keep the common tone B in the tenor. That becomes the chordal seventh. And I will allow my alto to leap up from D to G. This is another complete solution for the voice leading and part writing of this progression. Now finally, let's look at all 4 of these examples in a minor key. Take a second to note where that deceptive motion was in each progression, and notice which soprano lines go with each of those bass lines moving from scale degree 5 to scale degree 6. Thanks for watching.